This is Deep Dish on Global Affairs, going beyond the headlines on critical global issues. I'm Brian Hansen with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this week we're looking at how nations around the world have responded to gun violence and mass shootings. I also want to note that this episode is being recorded in front of a live audience. In recent weeks, news in the United States has been filled with devastating string of mass shootings, from the 4th of July parade in Highland Park, Illinois, to the rampage at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas in May, to killings in a Buffalo grocery store in April. And while these events have received a lot of attention, many others have not. In fact, so far in 2022, there have been over 300 mass shootings defined as 4 or more people shot, and we're only in July. Further, mass shooting deaths are only a small portion of the estimated more than 24,000 gun deaths in the United States so far this year. In what's become a ritual after mass shootings, political debate erupts about what to do to prevent events like this in the future, including the possibility of gun control. But often, little or no policy action results. Sadly, mass shootings and gun violence have occurred in other countries as well, and many of those countries have implemented policies in response that may offer lessons to the United States. So today we want to look at to what extent the United States is an international outlier in gun violence. How have other nations responded to prevent mass shootings and gun deaths? And how successful have they been? And finally, are there lessons for the United States to learn from what other countries have done? To help explore these issues, I'm joined today by Phillip Alpers. Phillip is an adjunct associate professor at the University of Sydney School of Public Health and the founding director of gunpolicy.org, a global nonpartisan organization which compares armed violence, gun legislation, and injury prevention worldwide. Welcome to Deep Dish, Phillip.
Thank you, Brian. It's good to be with you.
Phillip, I want to start out by asking you to help us understand gun violence in the United States and how it compares to that in other countries. We often hear that the United States is an outlier, but what does that really mean?
What it really means is exactly that the United States is a spectacular outlier in gun violence. Now, you're no more violent as a people, you're no more mentally ill as a people, you're no more insecure as a people than any other country in the Western world. However, the big difference is in lethal violence. In the United States, you have a huge number, as you well know, of gun shootings which are fatal. And as a renowned criminologist in the United States once said, Franklin D. Zimbring, that you are just as likely to get punched in the mouth in a bar in Los Angeles as you are in Sydney, Australia. But you're many, many, many more times likely to get shot in the United States. And the reason for that is that you're the only country on earth that has more guns than you have people. And it's the availability of firearms which is more and more becoming clearly associated with the number of gun deaths.
And can you talk a little more about, just in terms of the firearms that we have here, both the quantity as well as the types of firearms that are owned by the public? How does that compare with other countries?
Well, other countries set down 3 pillars of gun control at the beginning of last century, in fact. Almost all of the great empires of Europe and Asia agreed that they needed to have gun controls largely because of soldiers returning with their guns from wars and using them in domestic violence, robberies, etc. And also the threat of revolution, which was felt very acutely by the empires in those days. And so all of the European empires based and China and Japan all almost coincidentally increased their gun laws, tightened their gun laws during that time. And they settled on 3 pillars of gun control. One is that you license the person. Just as you license the driver of a car, you license the user of a firearm. Then you register the object, just as you just as you register a car, you register a gun. And the third pillar was conditional privilege. And that is the concept in law in almost all of these countries that ownership of a firearm is a conditional privilege. Just like owning a license to drive a motor vehicle, if you do something silly on the road, you can lose your license. And so these three pillars were adopted by not just the empires, but also by all of their colonies. That means that 150 countries at least around the world, and we monitor them all, have legislation which enshrines all three of those conditions. Now, the only country in the world that has substantially avoided all of those three pillars of gun control is the United States. You don't have national licensing for gun owners. You don't have national registration for registration is very patchy and only for machine guns and sworn-off shotguns and things like that. And in a few states which have had great results, mainly on the eastern and western seaboards. So, we've just done a study recently in which we showed that the United States is the only country in the world that has an equivalent of the Second Amendment. Other countries have something, one other country has something a little bit similar, and that's Switzerland. But Switzerland has had some great changes recently, and they used to encourage all of their military men. As you know, every person has to become a soldier, whether they are male or female, at a certain age, and they're all given a Sturmgewehr, which is an assault rifle. And they used to bring them home, but and store them at home with their ammunition in case of civil war, in case of insurrection. And the result of that, they realized, was that you got a lot of domestic shootings with military guns. You got a lot of suicides with military guns. So now they've stopped that. They've banned soldiers from taking their assault weapons home, and have had a tremendous effect on gun suicide and domestic violence involving guns. So once again, the United States is very much an outlier, and 90% of the world's countries have pretty comprehensive gun registration and gun licensing, and have nothing like the Second Amendment. The only country in the world that has an equivalent to the Second Amendment is the United States. So that's the evidence I submit for the United States being an outlier.
So even with all the three pillars that you talked about in other countries have experienced mass violence as well. And, some of those countries are somewhat similar to us in that they've got a history of relatively, as you point out, not nearly as extensive as the United States, but relatively high levels of gun ownership and lesser, restrictions. And I'm particularly interested in the experience of countries that had that at a starting point, went through a mass shooting incident, and then responded and drove changes to policies. And if I could start with Australia, because in so many ways, Australia and the United States have kind of similar histories around this. A history of guns in the rural setting, for us, our frontier, a history of conservative governments that were reluctant to impose gun control. So could you talk us through what happened in Australia to trigger action and what was done?
Well, it was very surprising. It was tragic, but very surprising to Australia and the world. We had a brand new conservative prime minister. He was referred to by George W. Bush as America's sheriff in the Pacific, which not everybody welcomed as a description. But he was very, very friendly to the United States and very conservative, the most conservative prime minister we've had for decades. Now, a few weeks into his first term of office came a mass shooting in the small township of Port Arthur in Tasmania, an island state off the south of Australia. And Tasmania had the slackest gun laws in Australia. And a young man was able to buy a couple of assault rifles and kill 35 people in a matter of moments, he killed his first 20 people in about 90 seconds, and in a cafe. Now, that just horrified Australia. I shouldn't say nothing like that had happened, because we had a string. Port Arthur was simply the straw that broke the camel's back, because Australia had a string of mass shootings. We'd lost more than 100 people in 14 mass shootings in that decade and a decade that preceded that. And Australians were just absolutely horrified and fed up. And as a result, the opinion polls showed 95% support for all those three pillars of gun control, which were not uniform across Australia. Some states had very slack gun laws. Others had relatively tight gun laws. What John Howard did when he came back from the funerals at Port Arthur was to immediately announce that Australia would ban all of the semi-automatic long arms that had been used and are the choice of mass shooters around the world in these tragic events, and that Australia would then make uniform all of the three pillars of gun control right across the 8 states. We have a federal system like yours. And the surprising thing was that 12 days later, he got the agreement, or he bullied the states and territories, their police ministers and their premiers, to accept this extraordinary change in Australian legislation. And they all accepted it, and we had what became the National Firearms Agreement, which not just bought back a huge number of firearms and destroyed them, but Australia, over the decades that followed, Australia destroyed around about 30% of the firearms, and that was with huge civilian support. The polls were running 95% in favour of all of this, and all political parties, all the major political parties, the three key parties that have been around for years, all of them agreed that this must be done, and it was absolutely conceded across the country that this would be done. And no government could have survived the next election if they hadn't brought in gun control. So the result of that, as I say, Australia destroyed over a period of years. And they spent, the governments put a small levy equivalent to about $15 per taxpayer on the next year's Medicare levy, health levy. And that $15 paid for the buyback of round about 70,000 semi-automatic firearms, which were then destroyed. You possibly saw the photos of them. But most importantly, I think, was the uniform registration across Australia and uniform gun licensing, uniform gun owner training. Everybody was suddenly forced to prove a genuine reason for owning a firearm. In other words, if you owned a deer-stalking rifle in suburban Sydney or Melbourne, and you said that your purpose for owning that was deer-stalking, then you had to prove that you had written access to approval to shoot deer on a property, and that property actually had some deer on it. And so you were forced to a whole new level of proof that you needed each gun, not just any gun, but each gun that you wanted to own. That brought in a tremendous result, over the years, and we've researched this now for 25 years. Over the years, the risk of dying by gunshot in Australia dropped by more than half, and it's stayed that way ever since. But the most spectacular result, which has been touted around the world, was that although we had 14 mass shootings in the decade before and including Port Arthur back in 1996, after these gun laws, there was not a single mass shooting until 2018, when there was one. And the definition here of mass shooting was 5 or more people shot dead in a single in proximate events, not including the perpetrator. So quite similar to the to the definition that used to be current in the United States. However, you've now changed your definitions and you now have much higher figures because the prevailing definition in the United States is 4 or more people not just shot dead, but injured by gunshot. And so that's the reason that you have much, much higher figures now.
So one clarifying question, and then I want to look at some other cases as well. When Australia implemented this, was the registration of gun owners and guns for all kinds of firearms or only the semi-automatic rifles?
It was patchy across the country. Semi-automatic rifles were by and large more controlled than others. Handguns have always been controlled. Since the 1930s, you've had to have a license and very good reason to own a handgun, a pistol or a revolver. And basically only pistol club members in police-approved pistol clubs shooting Commonwealth games or Olympic disciplines were allowed to own handguns. And so that was a huge difference here. But no, the guns that were tackled, the guns that were prohibited, were the weapon of choice for mass shooters because mass shooters get the most publicity. They're an absolute, a very small minority of shootings. And of course, there are much more predominant shootings, which I hope you'll allude to, which we need to put a lot more focus on. Mass shootings are simply the ones that get the headlines and get the knee-jerk reactions. Yes, it was patchy across Australia. Some states registered all their guns. Some states registered only some. Some states licensed all gun owners, some only some, etc. It was too patchy to go into, much as it is in the United States. But the great achievement, even more so than the buyback in Australia, was to get uniform gun laws, not federal, they're all controlled by the states, to get uniform gun laws right across Australia and to enforce those gun laws. They're being enforced now as they never were before because police have realized, a whole new generation of police have had an attitudinal change, which makes them realize that controlling guns is the solution is the one thing that stops gun deaths.
So I want to build on that a little bit to ask you to briefly share some other examples of countries that responded to mass shootings with controls of some kind or another on firearms. What are some of the most prominent examples to your mind, and were they effective as Australia's been?
Yes, there were, prior to Port Arthur, just before Port Arthur, were of course the Dunblane shootings, where 16 children were shot to death by a licensed pistol club member and handgun owner in Dunblane, Scotland. Now, the UK has a knee-jerk reaction to gun violence, largely because of the class system. The wealthy went out and shot game, whereas the poor were the poachers. And the gun laws have always reflected that in the UK, very tight. But after Dunblane and what preceded it, what was called the Hungerford Massacre back in 1996, they just simply banned almost all certainly all civilian handguns and a great majority of civilian long guns, although shotguns still had a special place in the UK because of their tradition of shooting grouse and so on. And so the UK had an even more stringent reaction to those shootings. They simply banned handguns. And in countries like Brazil did some of the same. They had a huge buyback and public health, an encouraging public health result. But now Brazil, under the current president, has slid in the opposite direction and now has much more permissive gun laws, and they're feeling the effects of that in terms of homicide and suicide by gun. Argentina did a huge buyback, and as did Brazil, as I say, and other countries across the world. We monitor 250 jurisdictions across the world in all their legislation, and read them in all their various languages. And we can say that the tendency has been in the last several decades to tighten gun laws right around the world. But some countries are not the same. Some countries have slackened their gun laws. It's very hard to quantify that because of all the millions of variations. Some gun laws run to 120, 180 pages just for one state. So it's hard to say, but the tendency does seem to be to tightening gun laws, especially in relation to the guns that are chosen by mass killers, the semi-automatic assault rifles, the rapid-fire long guns, and handguns, which are increasingly becoming more of a problem in many countries. Now, when we talked about gun death rates, I should emphasize that the United States is nowhere near the worst. The Central American countries lead the pack. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador have much higher rates of gun death than the United States. However, you rarely compare yourselves to those countries. If you compare the United States to the OECD countries, which are the 38 developed countries around the world, industrialized nations, the United States is even more of an outlier in those countries.
So, in addition to, we've talked about banning weapons or certain types of weapons, talked about buybacks of various types. Are there other measures that have been put into place in other countries that have been highly effective?
No, there are very few highly effective single measures. Excuse me. There is no silver bullet to be trite about it. There's no single solution. And what has to be appreciated is that there's direct parallel here, especially in the United States, to your admirable control of road deaths. In the 1950s, you allowed road deaths to get away on you, just as you've allowed gun deaths to get away on you in these decades. But the response was very different. The response came from the public health community, and a whole raft of new measures came in to seatbelts, airbags, drunk driving laws, even moving lampposts back from the edge of the road and putting them on the other side of the pavement saved lives, roundabouts, any number of things. And this was a holistic approach right across a whole series of public health indicators, which succeeded dramatically. And the United States was the world's leader, is still in many ways the world's leader in reducing the road toll. You did it spectacularly. And the world followed suit, and we're very grateful for that example. Now, what we now know is that those same measures, those same methods, not precisely the same, but the same theory behind them, of reducing your road toll, your HIV toll, your malaria, smallpox, whatever you look at around the world, the public health principles are much the same. And if you apply those to guns, you will have the same result. I don't think there's any question about that. I'm often accused of being the only optimist in the room, but I do actually believe that the United States will reverse its gun death problem using the standard public health procedures that have been used by everybody else. But first, you have to get ideology out of the way. Just as you had to get shift ideology aside with the HIV epidemic, you'll have to do the same with guns. And that won't happen until I'm long dead. But it will eventually happen. And I do encourage you to have hope for that reason.
And to that point, is there any pattern that you've seen in the countries that, we've talked about a number of countries that were headed in one direction and then fundamentally changed their approach to gun control. Are there any commonalities that would give those who see that as the right way forward for the United States hope that even if it happens after your death, that we will move in that direction? Or what should we look for in terms of the building of the political momentum that is required granted, we've got this Second Amendment issue as well, as you pointed out. But are there things we can learn from other places about the politics?
Oh, yes. Painful lessons. I was working on firearm injury prevention in the United States at Harvard back in the days of Columbine. Now, we all thought that Columbine would be the turning point, the threshold, the point at which nobody could take any more. How naive we were. All the shootings since then. And much worse shootings. Now, what horrifies me is the scale, the tragic toll that it's going to take for the tipping point to be reached. There will be a tipping point, but it's horrifying to imagine how big it's going to have to be in the United States before you start to do the common sense, public health, approach to injury prevention. And, but I do believe it'll happen. But it's going to, I'm afraid it's very obvious that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And as I say, ideology is the enemy here. Ideology, the belief that a gun makes you safer, which is a tremendous myth. I mean, so many studies have shown that you're far more at risk from a gun in the home, than you are from having no gun in the home. And so, and that applies especially in domestic violence and suicide, which are the leading causes of death. Your number of suicides is higher than your number of homicides, gun homicides, and yet the media almost neglect to mention suicide in many reports. So from a public health point of view, these two things are just as preventable. Gun suicide, it should be just as preventable as gun homicide. And we don't really care much about the motivation. A doctor in an emergency department doesn't really care why the person was shot. They just set about stopping it, staunching the flow of blood, and then trying to stop it happen, preventive medicine. But it's very easy for somebody outside the United States to be pious about what you should do. There is no simple solution. It's going to be a hard battle. And you said there's no point in pretending that you can do what Australia did. We destroyed 30% of the guns in civilian hands in this country. To do that in the United States, you'd have to destroy 90 million firearms at least. Now, that's simply not going to happen. Well, not in my lifetime. So, I step back now, having offered my opinions. I step back and say, look, it's your problem. It's your Second Amendment, and the Second Amendment is the problem. And it's up to you to solve it.
So I think one of the things that's interesting listening to you is that the consistency of the approach that has been taken across different countries that have had an impact on the problem. It sounds like there may be no single measure that can be a silver bullet. There is a pattern of approaches that seems to have been effective. Is that right?
Yes, we here at the University of Sydney, we've surveyed all of the gun laws of virtually every country, 198 or 250 jurisdictions around the world. And what we can say is that Australia, no country has the toughest or the slackest gun laws. The UK is tougher than Australia in that they have banned handguns. Australia is tougher than the UK in some other indicators. But what I can say across all of those countries is that Australia has, and I'm saying this not because I'm Australian, I'm actually from the rival country across the ditch, New Zealand. So I'm saying that Australia has got it right, that they introduced a holistic, right across the board set of public health measures, just as you did with road safety and many other problems. And it's that multidisciplinary public health approach to gun control, which works, which has been shown to work in some countries. which will eventually, I'm sure, triumph in the United States.
Well, very good. I appreciate that. I now want to open it up to questions in the audience and invite people to come up to the microphone and ask your question. Please, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Hina Mohammed. I'm from the UK, so we have a very different relationship with guns, as you've talked about. But given that in the US, it's an ideological phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon that's rooted in the rights bestowed by the Second Amendment, how do policy responses have to reflect that? How do you root them in changing hearts and minds? And what kind of policy can we implement and talk about that tackles that ideological perspective before you start talking about things like buyback programs or melting guns down or bans, before you even approach the question around a gun's making me safer or I fundamentally have a right to it that can't be infringed upon?
Right. Well, that's the big question. As you know, some small measures have been taken in the United States recently. They usually focus on access to firearms of people who shouldn't have them, which is a perfectly good approach to take, but it's only a very small part of the problem. The mistake that people make is to tackle the edges, tackle the problems around the edges and think that that's going to solve the problem. I don't think anybody believes that the gun laws that have been passed in the United States recently, or the executive orders, etc., are going to make a dramatic difference. What's going to make a dramatic difference is a national determination to follow the standard public health principles, the ideology, and the Second Amendment is a major hurdle. As I say, the United States has only one such amendment, and it's unique in interpreting that amendment to mean what it means. The original founders had a very different view of that language. But you've done this with prohibition. You overthrew, I forget the legal term, but you reversed the prohibition amendment. You did the same to curb slavery in the United States. And you've done it before with amendments. It is just a legal amendment. It can be changed. And there have been Supreme Court justices, retired Supreme Court justices, who've said precisely that. And who've also said that the current interpretation of the Second Amendment is, in the words of one former Supreme Court justice, the biggest fraud that has ever been inflicted on the American population, to suggest that the Second Amendment says what the NRA claims it says. But it is going to take a huge, huge shift. Americans know how big that shift is. They must see me as completely nuts suggesting that the Second Amendment can in any way be affected. But it can be, and it must be.
Hi, this is sort of a piggyback on that last question. Arguably, the Second Amendment in the U.S. was really founded on racism and a concession to slaveholders in the South who were worried about the risk of revolts and didn't want to give up, control of local militias. That racism continues to be a fundamental problem in the U.S., and I'm just curious, hopefully in your lifetime, but is that really the root of what's getting in the way of the U.S. changing and fear of others? And are there other countries where you've seen, that fear of others being at the root of gun policies and, successfully overcoming that?
Nowhere more pronounced, I think, than in the United States. The fear of others, the fear of difference, of race, it's a fear that you've had since the first Pilgrims landed, since you eliminated most indigenous peoples. It's a fear based entirely on race and of difference. And there is also a white male resistance to gun control, which you've seen more and more in recent years. 98% of gun killers are men. It is a male problem. And it's these overarching social effects like poverty, being disenfranchised, as many white males feel they are being, by stripping guns from their possession. And yet, remember, here's another parallel. Remember how you did this, what I mentioned, you controlled automobiles. And now, all those decades later, automobiles are still just as entrenched in male sexuality and male pride. They still have exactly the same social effect as they used to have. It didn't strip males of their masculinity to control road deaths. It won't do that with guns either. And there are a lot of fears out there that have to be overcome. And in the United States, as I say, I think they're far more pronounced than they are in many other countries. And you've recognized the number of the problem. Behind the problem is the fear of others.
Just to give you some background, I've lived in 13 different countries, Europe, Latin America, USA, over the last 30, 40 years. No place has the weapons here, and I've won awards actually in shooting competitions. So my question to you is this. The approach that they're taking today in America is to start from the top at 390 million weapons and try to work down. And that's not going to work. How would you go about doing just the opposite, saying, let's start from zero and decide who should and what kind of weapon they can have, like if they're living out in the countryside, and what organizations would you get involved to bring this critical mass to beat the daylights out of NRA?
Oh, here we get into very dangerous territory. I can't, as a New Zealander living in Australia, I'm not going to suggest that all of that can happen. I mean, it's not possible in the United States to reverse all of those prejudices overnight. And it certainly wasn't possible in Australia. There was great resistance. There was quite a strong gun lobby in Australia and surprisingly New Zealand and they're the people who held back the gun laws for decades before finally a tragedy forced something to happen. For example, in New Zealand, they had the Christchurch Mosque tragedy, in which 51 people were shot dead by an Australian who had crossed the Tasman Sea because he was forbidden to use these semi-automatic weapons, forbidden to own them, forbidden to get a license in Australia under the new laws. And so he came to New Zealand, which had slacker laws, and he was able to get an entry-level gun, rifle, and then convert it into what people call an assault weapon to use in that massacre. So we have such different societies, and although there are great similarities, I feel very akin to the United States, as many New Zealanders and Australians do, more than any other country these days. But we look with perplexity and sometimes fury at the blindness of the American policy system, which allows this killing to go on when the results, some of the solutions are so blindingly obvious. And one of those would be to reduce the number of guns available, as you suggest. I don't think for a moment you can do it from the bottom up. But there will have to be huge attitudinal changes. Who knows what they're going to be? They'll probably be, as I say, be brought about by an unfathomably large tragedy, which will finally shift politicians to do the right thing.
Well, I think talking about what we can see, I appreciate you coming on today, Phillip Alpers of the University of Sydney, to help us reflect on what's happened in other places in the world in order to try to get their hands around this horrible problem. And one of the hopeful parts of this conversation is that you've pointed to places that have actually been very successful at doing that. Thanks so much for being on Deep Dish and sharing this experience with us.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invitation.
And thank you for tuning in to this episode of Deep Dish as well. Please take a moment to review our show to help more listeners find us and to help us keep making the show better. If you're looking for more Deep Dish, tap the subscribe button in your podcast app so you can get each and every episode as it's released. You can find our show under Deep Dish on Global Affairs wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you think you know someone who would enjoy today's episodes, take a moment, tap the share button, and send it to them as well. This live recording will also be available if you're interested in watching the event. You can find the link of the video in the show notes or on the Chicago Council on Global Affairs YouTube page. As a reminder, the opinions you heard today belong to the people who expressed them and not the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This episode is produced by Kira Daring and Ian Whitaker. It's edited by Joe Palermo. I'm your host, Brian Hansen, and we'll be back soon with another slice of Deep Dish.